There is a kind of violence that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come dressed in shadows or preceded by a warning. It doesn't wait for the dead of night or creep through broken windows. Sometimes the most devastating violence in human history has hidden itself inside the most unremarkable of moments: a parking lot at noon, a bus stop on a Tuesday morning, a road so familiar that it barely registers as a road at all. It's the violence that hides inside routine. Inside the ordinary. Inside the spaces we've walked 1,000 times without thinking, because we have convinced ourselves, somewhere deep in the architecture of our minds, that familiarity is the same thing as safety. We tell ourselves certain things to sleep at night. We tell ourselves that danger looks a certain way, that it announces itself in the tilt of a stranger's gaze, in the creak of an unusual sound, in the sensation of something being wrong before anything actually is. We tell ourselves that we will know it when we see it. That the places we know, the streets we've worn down with the soles of our own shoes, will protect us through that very familiarity. The corner shop. The school gate. The route to work. These places feel safe not because they are safe, but because we have survived them, over and over again, and survival starts to feel like armor. But sometimes the armor isn't there. Sometimes a woman pulls on her pink coat on an ordinary Thursday evening in November, says something casual to her husband, steps out into the cold dark of an English autumn, and walks toward a street she has walked dozens of times before, and the street is not the same street it was the day before. Something is waiting. Something she cannot see, cannot anticipate, because nothing about that evening would have told her to be afraid. And that's the thing that stays with you long after you learn what happened. Not just the violence. Not just the cruelty. But the absolute, devastating normality of the moment before. The coat being buttoned. The door being closed. The quiet assumption that she would be back before the evening was over. She was 47 years old. She was a mother of 3. She was someone's wife, someone's daughter, someone who laughed and worked hard and had built a life out of ordinary things, milk rounds and Sunday mornings and the familiar weight of a family around her. She was not famous. She was not powerful. She was not the kind of woman whose disappearance would make national headlines for weeks, though it should have. She was the kind of woman who kept the world quietly running, the kind of woman whose absence tore a hole in everything without the world fully understanding what it had lost. On the evening of Thursday, November 14, 1996, Vera Holland left her home on St. Barnabas Road in Shinfield Rise, South Reading, Berkshire, to walk to a KFC restaurant on Shinfield Road. The restaurant was less than 5 minutes from her front door. She was planning to pick up a takeaway for the evening. She never arrived. She never came home. And for 2 days, no one outside of that neighborhood knew what had happened to her, until a motorist on the A327 spotted flames in the darkness before dawn on a Saturday morning, and the flames told a story that has never, to this day, been fully told. A story about what can happen in the space of minutes. About what lies waiting inside ordinary evenings. About how quickly, and how completely, a life can be interrupted and destroyed. This is Vera's story. And the fact that you are here, watching this, right now, matters more than you might think. Because Vera Holland's murder remains unsolved. Almost 30 years have passed. Her children have grown older without answers. A coroner looked at the evidence in 1997 and told a courtroom, "It looks like the person who did this will get away with it." He was right, so far. But so far is not forever, and stories like this one, told and retold, shared and remembered, have a way of finding the people who need to hear them. The people who drive that road. The people who remember 1996 in reading. The people who know something they have never said out loud. So stay with this. Every second you spend here keeps Vera's name alive, and that matters in ways that are real and that go far beyond this screen. But before we get into the next twist in this investigation, I'm curious, what device are you using right now? Phone under the covers. Tablet on the couch. Desktop with headphones on so nobody knows what you're listening to. Drop your location and your setup in the comments, I read them. And if you're here for gripping, detailed true crime stories, make sure you like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's go back to reading. Let's go back to November. Let's start where this story always has to start, not with the crime scene, not with the carpet, not with the fire burning by the side of the A327 in the dark before dawn. Let's start where every tragedy truly begins. With the person. With the life. With the 47 years that came before that Thursday evening and that deserve to be held in full, before we get anywhere near the darkness that ended them. Vera Holland was born Vera Vince on the 8th of April 1949, in London. She came into the world in the post-war years, in a Britain that was rebuilding itself, a Britain where ordinary people were doing what ordinary people always do after devastation. They were getting on with it. They were working. They were building families. They were making something out of whatever they had. And in many ways, Vera embodied that spirit her entire life. She was not someone who gave up. She was not someone who stayed still when life became hard, and life, it seems, gave her plenty of opportunities to prove that. She married for the first time in 1967, at 18 years old, to a man named Edward Bennett. By the time she was in her 20s she was a mother. Her daughter Dawn arrived in 1965, and her son Andrew in 1969. Those two children would grow up, build their own lives, and still be searching for justice for their mother decades later. The image of them standing at a press conference in 2016, 20 years after Vera's death, asking the public for help, is one of the defining images of this case. Two grown adults, still orphaned by violence, still waiting for an answer that has never come. Vera and Edward parted ways by 1978, the year she married again, this time to a man named Richard Stevens in Lambeth. With Richard, she had her youngest daughter, born in 1981. By the time Vera was in her 40s she had been through enough to break lesser people, marriages, separations, motherhood 3 times over, the constant, grinding work of keeping a family intact across the years. But she hadn't broken. She had kept moving. In 1991 she married Brian Holland, 6 years her junior, her third husband. By the mid-90s, Vera and Brian had settled into a life in Shinfield Rise, South Reading, a quiet, residential part of town, the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where the streets have a familiar pulse, where a woman can walk to a fast food restaurant in the dark and feel, entirely reasonably, that she is safe. They were described by the detective leading her murder investigation as extremely hard-working and normal. The local paper, with that particular brand of English sentimentality, called them inseparable. They ran a milk delivery round together in the nearby town of Wokingham. Think about that for a moment. Think about what that means, not just the shared labor of it, the early mornings and cold hands and the rhythmic discipline of a route done together, but the closeness it implies. Two people who built a working life around each other. Who started their days together before the rest of the world woke up. Inseparable. That word, once you know what was coming, becomes almost unbearable. Vera's youngest daughter, 15-year-old Claire, was living with them at the time. A teenager in the house. The warm clutter of family life. Brian at home, Claire somewhere in the house, and Vera deciding on a Thursday evening in November that she'd nip out and get some food. 3 minutes away. She'd be back before anyone missed her. She wasn't. And here is where the story breaks open, not with drama, not with a confrontation or a chase or anything that the imagination reaches for when it tries to make sense of violence. It breaks open quietly. In the space between a front door closing and a destination never reached. In the gap between a woman walking into the dark and the darkness swallowing her whole. What happened in those 3 minutes? That's the question this entire story is built on. That's the question Thames Valley Police spent years, and then decades, trying to answer. That's the question Vera's children still carry with them. And that's the question we are going to sit inside together, carefully, respectfully, factually, for the rest of this video. Because the answer matters. Because Vera matters. And because somewhere out there, someone knows something. Someone has always known something. And this story isn't over until they say it out loud. Stay with me. To understand what was taken on the evening of November 14, 1996, you have to understand what was there before. You have to understand the texture of the life that was interrupted, not just its facts, not just the bare data of marriages and children and addresses, but what it felt like to be Vera Holland, moving through the world in the mid-90s in a quiet residential corner of Berkshire. Vera was 47 years old, which sounds like the middle of a life. Because it was the middle of a life. She was not at the beginning, not approaching an end. She was squarely in the center of everything, old enough to know herself, young enough to still be building. 3 marriages told the story of a woman who had not given up on love or partnership or the possibility of something good, even when things had been hard. 3 children told the story of a woman who had poured herself into other people and meant it. A milk round told the story of a woman who got up early and worked hard and did not expect the world to come to her. She went to it, before the sun rose, in the cold, with her husband beside her. The people who knew Vera described her in the way people always describe those who are suddenly gone, in sudden, sharp terms, as though proximity to loss makes language more precise. Hardworking. Normal. Devoted. And those words, thin as they sound on a page, contain entire worlds. Hardworking means early mornings and aching backs and the quiet pride of doing something honest. Normal means a life without spectacle, which is the same as saying a life that mattered without anyone making a fuss about the fact that it mattered. Devoted means 3 children who grew up knowing they were loved. It means a husband who, when she didn't come home on a November evening, waited more than 4 hours before calling the police, probably because he kept telling himself she'd walk through the door any second. She left on a Thursday. The 14th of November 1996. The time of year in England means that 6 o'clock in the evening is already fully dark. Not dimming, dark. The kind of dark that settles early in autumn and stays, and that people who live in places like Reading learn to move through without thinking about it, the same way they learn to move through rain and fog and the particular chill that settles in off the Thames Valley at that time of year. It is a darkness that is so routine it doesn't feel threatening. It is just the dark. It is just November. It is just the world being the world. At 6:10 p.m., Vera put on her pink coat, described later as a 3/4 length pink coat, though there's a note from someone who knew her insisting it was a pink duffel coat, which is the kind of small detail that matters intensely to the people who love someone and want her remembered correctly. She paired it with a green tartan skirt, a black jumper, and black shoes. There is something achingly ordinary about this outfit. It is not the clothing of someone who planned anything significant that evening. It is not a going-out outfit or a traveling outfit. It is the clothing of someone who expected to be back inside within 20 minutes, sitting down to dinner with her family in the warm. She left through the front door of 63 Street Barnabas Road. She stepped out onto the pavement. She began walking toward Shinfield Road, where the KFC sat, and where a Thursday evening would have meant other people around, cars, the gentle activity of a suburban evening, the ordinary visible presence of human life going about its business. She was not walking into emptiness. She was walking into a November Thursday in a residential English neighborhood. Into the entirely predictable geography of a route she would have known. She never arrived. This is not dramatic license. This is not inference or speculation. The CCTV cameras at the KFC restaurant on Shinfield Road captured footage from that evening, and Vera Holland does not appear in that footage. Not arriving. Not leaving. Not walking past. She is simply absent from the frame, at a time when she should have been arriving, in a place she should have reached within minutes of leaving her front door. She was last confirmed to have been seen when she walked out of her own home. And then the cameras see nothing. Think about what that means. A walk of 3 to 5 minutes, depending on the source, the estimates vary slightly, but everyone agrees it was short. The kind of distance a person covers without thought. Without preparation. Without any of the mental calculation that goes into a longer journey. A quick walk to get a takeaway. And somewhere inside that brief geography, between the door of her house and the door of that restaurant, something intercepted her. Something ended her life. For 4 hours and 35 minutes, Brian Holland presumably waited. Perhaps he assumed she'd run into someone she knew. Perhaps he thought she'd made a detour, called in somewhere, been waylaid by one of the small social interruptions that are so common in a neighborhood where you recognize the faces around you. Perhaps he sat watching television. Perhaps he made tea. Perhaps he told 15-year-old Claire she'd be back soon. Perhaps, as the hour grew later and the silence at the door stretched out and the evening became undeniably wrong, he began to feel something he didn't yet have words for. At 10:45 p.m., Brian called the police. More than 4 hours after Vera left the house. More than 4 hours during which she was somewhere in the night, somewhere in the geography of that area, somewhere between the door of her home and wherever she had been taken. Police would later piece together a timeline that suggested she was killed very quickly after her disappearance. That the 4 hours Brian waited, the 4 hours during which help might theoretically have been sought sooner, did not ultimately change what had already happened to Vera. But the timing matters. Because everything in this case matters. Because there are details here that, even now, haven't been fully explained. The police were called. And the first response was what first responses always are in cases like this, the careful, systematic mobilization of a missing person search in a world that still, at this point, doesn't know if this is a missing person situation or something far worse. Thames Valley Police began looking for a 47-year-old woman in a pink coat who had gone to get a takeaway and hadn't come home. They canvassed the neighborhood. They checked CCTV. They spoke to staff at the KFC. None of it produced Vera. None of it produced a sighting of Vera beyond her own front door. And then came Friday, November 15th. And Friday was a day during which the world had not yet understood the full weight of what was happening. A day of searching and waiting and the grim, suspended quality of a case that hasn't broken yet. A day during which, according to witnesses who were later interviewed by police, Vera Holland's body was not yet visible at a particular spot on the A327 road between Shinfield and Arborfield. Not before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Police were certain of this. Witnesses confirmed it. Somewhere, on Friday afternoon, something moved. Something, or someone, transported Vera's body from the place she had been kept to the place she would be found. And that detail, that window between Thursday night and Friday evening, between a woman walking into the dark and a body arriving at a fly tip site 3 miles from her home, that window is where this entire investigation lives. That window is where all the questions are gathered. And it is a window that, nearly 30 years later, has never been fully opened. The answers are still out there. And the next part of this story is about what was found, and what the finding told investigators about the brutality and the cold calculation of what had been done to Vera Holland. Because on the morning of Saturday, November 16th, a motorist drove along the A327 and saw something that no one driving to work in the early morning hours should ever have to see. And nothing about this case would ever be the same. The A327 between the villages of Shinfield and Arborfield is not a dramatic road. It is an unremarkable stretch of English countryside, the kind of road that exists purely as a means of getting from one place to another, the kind of road that carries school runs and delivery vans and the quiet, steady traffic of people going about the business of living. It runs past fields and hedgerows and, just near the Thames water pumping station at a stretch of land known as Two Bridges, it passes what had become, by 1996, a notorious illegal fly tipping site. A lay-by, a turning, a patch of neglected ground where people dumped what they didn't want, logs, tires, rubbish, the unwanted weight of things that had outlived their usefulness. It was a place that didn't look like anything. That's important to understand. It did not look like a place where something significant would happen, which is precisely why someone chose it. At 5:30 in the morning on Saturday, November 16, 1996, a motorist on the A327 saw flames. Berkshire Fire and Rescue were called. They arrived at the site in the darkness before dawn and began working to extinguish the blaze. The pile was burning, logs and tires and the debris of a fly tip, the kind of fire that occasionally gets started by kids or by people burning waste illegally. This was, in the beginning, simply a fire. A call-out on a Saturday morning. The routine business of firefighters doing their work. And then, as the flames receded, they found her. Vera Holland was lying face down in the pile of rubbish. She was wrapped in a carpet. The carpet was beige, fawn-colored, as the British police reports describe it. She was partially clothed. The post-mortem would later reveal the specific items of clothing she was still wearing, a suspender belt and a petticoat. Undergarments. Everything else, the pink coat, the green tartan skirt, the black jumper, the black shoes, everything she had put on Thursday evening at 6:10 p.m. when she walked out of her front door, had been found in the burning pile. Burned. Deliberately burned. Along with her body. The fire had been started in an attempt to destroy the evidence of what had been done to Vera Holland. Whoever set that fire had stood in that lay-by in the darkness, or the dying light of a Friday evening, and made the decision to burn away the traces of a crime they had committed against a 47-year-old woman who had simply been walking to get a takeaway. The distance from Vera's home on St. Barnabas Road to the Two Bridges fly tip site is approximately 3 miles. 3 miles south. A short drive. An area familiar enough to someone who knew the roads of this part of Berkshire. An area isolated enough, and disreputable enough through its use as a dump site, that the presence of a fire in the early hours might not immediately alarm anyone who happened to pass. This was a calculated choice. Every element of the disposal, the location, the carpet, the fire, the timing, spoke of someone who was not in a panic. Someone who was, in some terrible way, thinking. And that is what made it so frightening to the detectives who arrived at that scene. Because there are murders that happen in the heat of a moment and then fall apart at the disposal stage, because panic makes people sloppy and sloppiness leaves evidence. And then there are murders where the planning doesn't stop at the act itself. Where it extends into what comes after. Where someone has thought, however crudely, about how to get away with it. This was not a body left where it fell. This was a body transported, wrapped, placed, and burned. Someone had, at minimum, a vehicle. Someone had, at minimum, the physical capability to move a human body wrapped in a section of carpet. Someone had, at minimum, a knowledge of this spot on the A327 and a reason to believe it was suitable for what they intended. Thames Valley Police launched a full murder investigation. Detective Superintendent Michael Short took charge of what would become one of the largest inquiries in Berkshire's criminal history. Within the first year, 80 police officers were involved. The numbers from that investigation are staggering: 1,669 people interviewed. 777 statements taken. Over 100,000 leaflets distributed to local people, appealing for information, describing a carpet, describing a woman, describing a pink coat. A female officer was dressed in clothing similar to what Vera had been wearing and was filmed reenacting the walk from Street Barnabas Road toward the KFC on Shinfield Road, in the hope that someone driving or walking nearby that Thursday evening might have their memory triggered by seeing the route again. Nothing solid emerged. Every lead, every vehicle sighting, every interview, every piece of forensic evidence from the family home, and there were over 100 samples taken when forensic teams sealed the house for 3 days, every single strand of inquiry came to the same place. A wall. A place where the evidence stopped and the silence began. And in that silence, the questions have lived ever since. But there was one piece of physical evidence that police believed held the key to everything. One piece of evidence that they publicized, described in detail, appealed publicly about, and which to this day has never been definitively traced to its source. The carpet. Think about what it means that she was found in a carpet. Not thrown in a ditch. Not left at the roadside. Not simply dumped in the way that a body left by someone panicking might be abandoned. She was wrapped. The carpet had been brought to wherever she was taken, or she had been brought to wherever the carpet was. One way or another, the carpet and Vera were brought together, and the carpet then became the means by which she was transported to the fly-tip site on the A327. The carpet, in the brutal logic of what had been done, was a container. A shroud that was also, the investigators understood, a potential fingerprint. Because carpets carry the marks of the rooms they come from. And this one had left marks everywhere. The post-mortem examination, carried out in the days following the discovery of Vera's body, confirmed what the condition of the scene had already suggested. Vera Holland had been strangled. Her face bore bruising consistent with an attack, a physical confrontation, a struggle, or something imposed with force. There was no evidence of sexual assault. This is a significant detail, and it shaped the direction of the investigation in ways that will become clearer as this story continues. Because the absence of sexual assault, combined with the deliberate removal and burning of her clothing, combined with the calculated nature of the disposal, all pointed investigators toward a particular kind of crime. Not opportunistic. Not random. Personal. Targeted. Or at the very minimum, something that became personal very quickly once it was in motion. Vera had been strangled, her body stored somewhere for over 24 hours, and then transported 3 miles from her home to be set on fire in a rubbish heap. The coroner, at the inquest in October 1997, would record a verdict of unlawful killing. He would say, in terms that still land like a stone dropped into still water, "It looks like the person who did this will get away with it." He said it in a courtroom. He said it in front of people who loved Vera. He said it because the evidence demanded honesty, and honesty demanded that someone say what the evidence was pointing toward, even when it was the worst possible thing to say out loud. But he was speaking in 1997. And 30 years is a long time for memories to shift. For allegiances to change. For people to carry secrets longer than secrets want to be carried. Someone out there knows something about a beige carpet. Someone out there knows something about a bedroom that used to have carpet and then didn't. Someone out there knows something about the evening of November 14, 1996, and a woman in a pink coat on a road in Reading. And the carpet itself, the forensic centerpiece of this investigation, the silent witness that outlasted the fire, that carried more information in its fibers than anything else at that crime scene, is the next thing we need to talk about. Because the carpet did not lie down quietly. And neither should this case. In murder investigations, physical evidence speaks with a patience that human witnesses often can't sustain. It doesn't get nervous. It doesn't revise its story. It doesn't become unavailable or move away or decide, years later, that it doesn't want to get involved. A piece of physical evidence sits exactly where it is and says exactly what it knows, and the only question is whether the people looking at it are asking the right questions. The carpet asked a lot of questions. It was a section of bedroom-quality carpet. Fawn in color, that shade of warm beige that was common in British homes of a certain era, the kind of carpet that would have been recognizable to anyone who lived in a family home in the 1980s or 1990s. Not cheap. Not the kind of carpet laid in hallways or kitchens. Bedroom quality, which is to say it was soft enough, thick enough, to have been chosen for a room where people slept and spent quiet time. It measured 9 feet 4 inches by 8 feet 2 inches, a significant section, large enough to cover most of a standard bedroom floor, which told investigators that whatever bedroom this had come from, it was not a tiny room. On one side of the carpet, there were 2 indentations. The kind of indentations that furniture makes in carpet when it sits in the same position for a long time. The heavy, patient press of weight, possibly matching pieces of bedroom furniture, the investigators noted. A double bed, perhaps. A wardrobe. 2 items that had stood in fixed positions for long enough to leave their mark permanently in the pile. If you have ever moved furniture and looked at the carpet underneath, you know exactly what this looks like, the compressed channels of long occupation. A bedroom that had been lived in. A room with a history that the carpet remembered even after the room itself was elsewhere. On the opposite side, there were 2 holes. Radiator pipe holes, the kind cut into carpet so that it can fit around the pipes that run from a wall-mounted radiator to the floor. This detail is almost unbearably specific in its investigative potential. Radiator pipe holes are not universal. They are not something every carpet has. They are specific to a room with a particular configuration, a room where the radiator pipes came up through the floor, where the carpet was cut to accommodate them, where whoever laid that carpet knew exactly where the pipes were and cut around them. This carpet came from a specific room. Not a type of room. A room. A real room, in a real house, somewhere in the geography of this investigation. Then there was the soil. And the weeds. Growing on the surface of the carpet, embedded in its fibers, the kind of organic matter that accumulates when something is stored outside for a period of time. Not left out one night. Stored. Long enough for weeds to take root and grow in the fabric. This told investigators that the carpet had spent time outdoors before it became the shroud in which Vera Holland was found. It had been removed from its bedroom, from the room where the furniture had pressed its marks into it, from the room with the radiator pipes, and it had been stored somewhere outside. In a garden, perhaps. Behind a shed. Under something. Long enough for nature to begin reclaiming it. And there was blood. Traces of Vera's blood in the carpet fibers. Which told investigators that Vera's body had been in contact with this carpet while she still had enough blood in her system to leave a trace, which, combined with the forensic analysis of her condition when found, led police to conclude that the carpet had been used to wrap her body relatively soon after her death. She had been placed inside it. Kept inside it. Transported inside it. For over 24 hours, according to the police's assessment of the timeline. Police publicly appealed for information about the carpet. They described its dimensions. Its color. Its particular features, the furniture indentations, the radiator pipe holes, the soil, and weeds. They asked, does anyone recognize this carpet? Does anyone know of a bedroom in this area that recently had its carpet removed and replaced? Does anyone know someone who would have had access to a section of carpet like this? Think about that appeal. Think about what answering it would have required. It would have required someone to say, yes. I know that carpet. I know that bedroom. I know who would have had access to it. Which is the same as saying, I know something about who killed Vera Holland. And no one came forward with information that broke the case. No one, in all the months and years of the investigation, definitively traced that carpet to its origin. Witnesses were able to narrow the window of when Vera's body was brought to the Two Bridges fly tip site. Multiple witnesses confirmed that she was not there before 4 o'clock on the afternoon of Friday, November 15th, which means that between Thursday evening and Friday afternoon, her body was being stored somewhere. Somewhere with a carpet. Somewhere near enough to the fly tip site that the transportation could happen between 4 o'clock on Friday and 5:30 on Saturday morning, when the fire was first reported. There were also reports of a fire at the same site on the evening of Friday, November 15th. Which raises the chilling possibility that an initial attempt to burn the body was made on Friday evening, failed or was interrupted, and that the fire which ultimately brought the fire service out on Saturday morning was a second attempt. 2 visits to the same site. 2 fires at the same location. A pattern of return that suggests whoever was doing this was not deterred by failure and was determined to complete what they had started. Witnesses also reported seeing a number of vehicles in the area around the relevant times. A light-colored Ford Fiesta was seen near the entrance to Hall Farm in the early morning hours of Saturday, November 16th. A transit van was seen lingering near the site on the day before Vera's body was discovered. A black Ford Granada was reportedly seen in the area on the night of her disappearance. None of these sightings led police to a definitive suspect. None of them broke the case open. They remain, like so much of the evidence in this investigation, fragments, compelling, suggestive, but ultimately incomplete. But take a moment with the carpet. Take a moment with what it represents beyond its forensic function. Somewhere, there is a bedroom. Or there was a bedroom. In the mid-1990s in the reading area, a room with 2 pieces of matching furniture that stood in fixed positions long enough to press their marks into the carpet beneath. A room with radiator pipes coming up through the floor. A room that, at some point before November 1996, had its carpet removed. And that carpet, instead of being thrown away, instead of going to a tip legally, instead of being left out for a skip, ended up outside. Stored. Out of sight. Waiting. Police were clear about what they believed. Vera Holland was killed shortly after she left her home on the evening of November 14th. Her body was placed in the carpet and kept somewhere for approximately 24 hours, overnight into Friday, through the daylight hours of Friday, before being transported to the A327 site on Friday afternoon or evening. Whoever did this needed to be able to move a body wrapped in a large section of heavy carpet. They needed a vehicle large enough to accommodate this. They needed to know about the fly tip site on the A327. They needed time. They needed access to the carpet. They needed somewhere to store a body for more than a day. None of this is the behavior of someone in a panic. None of this is improvised. This is the behavior of someone who, once they had done what they had done, proceeded with a degree of deliberate, terrible purpose. They managed the evidence as best they could. They moved when they judged it safe to move. They chose a site they believed would allow destruction of that evidence. They were wrong about the fire destroying everything. The carpet survived well enough to tell its story, and the postmortem survived the fire well enough to tell its story, but they had, apparently, calculated correctly about one thing. No arrest has ever followed. And it is at this point in the story that the investigation's attention began to turn, as it inevitably must, toward the people who were closest to Vera Holland. The people who knew her. The people who lived near her. The people whose lives were bound up with hers in ways that investigators needed to examine. Because everything this case suggested, the short distance from her home, the storage of the body, the knowledge of the local area, the carpet that came from a bedroom, pointed toward proximity. Whoever did this was not a stranger passing through. Whoever did this knew this neighborhood. Knew these roads. Possibly knew Vera herself. And knowing that, feeling the weight of that probability, changes everything about how you look at the people around her. Everything you thought you knew about this case is about to get more complicated. And some of what comes next is going to be hard to sit with. But stay with me. Because this is where the investigation really begins to breathe. There is a particular cruelty that unsolved murders inflict on the people closest to the victim. It is not a cruelty anyone intends, or at least, the investigation doesn't intend it, even when the investigation is what delivers it. But suspicion, in the absence of a definitive answer, has to go somewhere. And it goes, almost inevitably, to the people who were nearest. The people who had access. The people who, by virtue of their proximity to the victim, become the first and most logical place the investigators look. In November 1996, in the days immediately following the discovery of Vera Holland's body, Thames Valley Police sealed the family home on St. Barnabas Road for 3 days. Forensic teams moved through the house with the systematic patience of investigators who understood that what they were looking for might be invisible to the naked eye, but would not be invisible to the laboratory. They took over 100 forensic samples from the home. Fingerprint and blood tests were carried out on Brian Holland. The house where Vera had lived with her husband and her youngest daughter became, briefly, a crime scene to be examined rather than a home to be mourned in. Brian Holland, 41 years old, the men who had called police at 10:45 p.m. on November 14th, the men described alongside Vera as hardworking, normal, inseparable. Brian answered questions. He gave his account of the evening. He described what Vera had been wearing, the time she left, the purpose of the errand, the hours he had waited before making the call. He submitted to fingerprinting and blood tests. He cooperated with an investigation that was trying to find the person who had murdered his wife. And then, in January 1997, 2 months after Vera's death, Brian Holland was arrested. He was held for a day. And then he was released on police bail. No charges were filed. No evidence emerged that changed his legal status from person of interest to charged suspect. He was released. And in March of that same year, Brian Holland threatened to take legal action against Thames Valley Police, making public his frustration with the way the investigation had been handled. The threat spoke of a man who felt he had been put through something profoundly unjust. Whether it reflected the experience of an innocent man wrongly subjected to investigation, or something more complicated, is something only Brian Holland knows for certain. But Brian was not the only person in Vera's life who found themselves in the crosshairs of this investigation. Living just a few houses down from Vera and Brian on the same street in Shinfield Rise was a man named Richard Stevens. Vera's second husband. The men she had married in 1978, the men she had had a child with, the men she had separated from at some point in the years before 1991. Richard Stevens was 50 years old in 1996. He lived on St. Barnabas Road with his wife, Kay, who was 42. Let that geography settle in for a moment. Vera's second ex-husband lived a few doors down from her and her third husband. In the same street. The kind of proximity that implies ongoing contact, or at the very least, regular visibility. The kind of proximity that makes the social geometry of everyone's lives complicated in ways that investigators would have been trained to notice. On the morning of December 17, 1996, 6 weeks after Vera's body was found, police arrested Richard Stevens and his wife Kay at 6:30 in the morning. They were taken in and held for 13 hours. And then they, too, were released on police bail. No charges were ever filed. No arrest in this case has ever led to prosecution. Kay and Richard Stevens, like Brian Holland, were released, and the investigation continued without them. 80 officers. 1,669 people interviewed. 777 statements taken. Over 100,000 leaflets. Road checks. Forensic reenactments. A female officer dressed in similar clothing to Vera's, walking the route from Street Barnabas Road to the KFC, in the hope that someone driving past that spot would remember seeing something on the night of November 14th and finally say something. Checks on vehicles. A close examination of every known associate, every neighbor, every person whose life had intersected with Vera's in the years leading up to her death. Nothing broke the case. What the investigation produced was an almost suffocating accumulation of detail that added up, eventually, to a picture with its center missing. Like a jigsaw puzzle where every border piece is in place and there's nothing in the middle. The frame was there, the carpet, the fire, the strangulation, the timeline, the vehicles, the geography, but the face, the identity, the person at the center of it all, remained absent. There was one other avenue of inquiry that emerged years later, in 2016, when Vera's children made their 20th anniversary appeal for information. In that appeal, alongside the renewed request for anyone with local knowledge to come forward, there was something else, a question about Christopher Halliwell. Christopher Halliwell is a name that will be familiar to many true crime followers. A former taxi driver from Swindon, he was ultimately convicted of 2 murders, the killing of Sion O'Callaghan in 2011, and the killing of Becky Godden, whose body he led police to during questioning. Halliwell was described by investigators as a man who had been targeting and killing women potentially for decades. His geography, operating throughout the Thames Valley and surrounding areas, familiar with rural roads, lay-bys, isolated spots, overlapped with the geography of Vera Holland's case in ways that Vera's family and their advocates found impossible to ignore. The head of Thames Valley Police's major crime review team, Peter Byrne, confirmed in 2016 that the possibility of a Halliwell connection to Vera's case was being kept open. He did not confirm a link. He did not name Halliwell as a suspect. He confirmed that it was a line of inquiry that had not been closed. Which is not the same thing as evidence. But it is also not nothing. Because here is what the Halliwell theory offers, and why it is worth taking seriously in a case like this. It offers an alternative to the assumption that Vera was killed by someone she knew. It offers the possibility that she was intercepted, quickly and efficiently, by someone with experience in predatory violence, someone who could identify and exploit the brief window of a woman walking alone on a dark road, someone who could manage the aftermath with the kind of cold calculation that the disposal of Vera's body suggested. Someone for whom this was not the first time. The absence of sexual assault in Vera's case is sometimes cited as an argument against Halliwell, whose known crimes against women had a sexual dimension. But investigators and criminal psychologists are careful to note that patterns of behavior are not always consistent across a killer's history. That the staging of a crime scene, the deliberate removal and destruction of clothing, can serve functions other than sexual. That the evidence of rage, the bruising, the strangulation, speaks to a personal violence that could be motivated by many things. Halliwell has never been officially linked to Vera Holland's murder. No forensic evidence connecting him to her case has been publicly confirmed. And so he remains, like Brian Holland and Richard Stevens and the unknown drivers of the Ford Fiestas and the transit van and the black Ford Granada, someone whose name exists in the orbit of this case without being definitively placed at its center. The case has no center. That is the terrible truth of it. But there are things the investigators know. There are things the carpet told them. There are things the timeline told them. And what those things tell us, what they tell anyone who looks carefully and honestly at the available evidence, is that the person who killed Vera Holland had a specific kind of knowledge. Not the knowledge of a stranger passing through. Not the knowledge of someone who happened to see a woman walking and made an impulsive, terrible decision that spiraled beyond control. The knowledge of someone who knew what to do next. Who knew where to go. Who had a carpet. Who had somewhere to keep her. Who had time, and a vehicle, and the cold-bloodedness to return to a site and try again when the first attempt to destroy the evidence didn't fully work. That is a specific kind of person. And that person, wherever they are, whatever age they are now, whatever life they have been living for the last 28 years, has never been brought to justice. The coroner said, in 1997, it looks like the person who did this will get away with it. But here is what the coroner didn't know in 1997. He didn't know that Vera's children would stand in front of cameras 20 years later and refuse to let her name be forgotten. He didn't know that the internet would exist in the way it does now, that stories like this one would find audiences of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in places the original investigation could never have reached. He didn't know that the world's capacity for memory, and for finding people who have been hiding, would grow in the years that followed. Someone knows something about a beige carpet. Someone knows something about a bedroom. Someone knows something about the night of November 14, 1996, and a woman in a pink coat who never reached her destination. This case is not cold. This case is waiting. Let's go back to the evidence. Let's go back to what is known, not what is suspected, not what is theorized, but what the post-mortem examination and the forensic analysis and the detailed reconstruction of the timeline have confirmed as fact. Because the facts in this case, even without a named perpetrator, tell a story that is precise enough to draw a shape around the person who committed this crime. A shape that gets more specific the longer you sit with it. Vera Holland died of strangulation. That is what the post-mortem confirmed. Strangulation is an intimate method of killing. It requires physical proximity. It requires time, not the instantaneous violence of a shooting, but the sustained, deliberate application of force to a person's throat. It requires that the killer be close enough to feel the resistance, to sustain the effort through the body's instinct to fight back. Whatever happened in those 3 to 5 minutes between Vera's front door and the KFC on Shinfield Road, what ultimately killed her was this, a pair of hands, or an arm, applied to her throat with sufficient force and sufficient duration to end her life. The bruising to her face is significant too. It speaks to an attack that was not merely instrumental, not simply a killing deployed as a means to a specific end, but one that involved something more volatile. She was hit. She was struck. There was impact to her face, not just around her throat. This is the vocabulary of a confrontation, whether it was a confrontation that was sought by the killer, that began in one way and escalated, or whether it was the violence of someone who needed to control what was happening quickly and violently. Investigators and forensic psychologists who study this kind of crime read the nature of injuries as a form of communication from the killer's emotional state. Bruising to the face, alongside strangulation, speaks to personal anger. To something beyond the merely functional. No sexual assault was found. This is a detail worth sitting with, because in the context of this crime it asks a question that doesn't have an easy answer. If the motive was not sexual, if the violence was not part of a pattern of predatory sexual aggression, then what was it? What drove someone to stop a 47-year-old woman on a dark road in Reading, kill her with their hands, take her somewhere, wrap her in a carpet, and hold her body for 24 hours before driving her to a fly tip and setting her on fire? Robbery. There's no evidence of that, and robbery does not typically lead to this kind of extended, deliberate disposal. The effort involved in what happened to Vera goes far beyond what a robbery gone wrong would necessitate. An opportunistic thief does not spend 24 hours planning the transportation of a body and sourcing a location for disposal. An opportunistic thief panics and runs. Whoever did this did not panic. Whoever did this managed the situation. Rage. Personal history. The targeting of Vera specifically. Investigators would have considered all of these. The geography of the crime, beginning and ending within 3 miles of her home, strongly suggests local knowledge, and local knowledge combined with personal violence suggests personal connection. Not necessarily deep personal connection. But something. Some thread. Some reason why Vera, specifically, was the person who was stopped on that road on that evening. Or, and this is the theory that her family began to explore in 2016, predatory opportunism of a specific kind. A killer who was practiced. Who targeted women in similar situations. Whose violence had a pattern that, mapped over enough cases, might eventually include Vera. Christopher Halliwell was operating as a taxi driver across the wider Thames Valley area in the 1990s. His routes, his knowledge of rural roads, his apparent familiarity with isolated disposal sites, all of this was in the minds of the people who raised his name in connection with Vera's case. And the deliberate, managed nature of the disposal is consistent with someone who had done this before. But here is what the timeline confirms, independent of any named suspect. It confirms that Vera was almost certainly killed on the evening of Thursday, November 14th, probably very quickly after leaving her home. The gap between 6:10 p.m. and the moment she should have appeared on the KFC's CCTV cameras is brief. Whatever happened, happened fast. There was no extended period of captivity. She did not spend the night of November 14th alive somewhere, waiting. The forensic evidence and the timeline both indicate she was killed quickly and then held, her body held, in that carpet, until Friday evening, when she was transported to the A327 site. Why hold the body? Why not move it immediately on Thursday night? The answer that investigators would naturally reach is that Thursday night was too risky. Perhaps there were people around. Perhaps the timing didn't work. Perhaps whoever had done this needed to wait for a window, a period when the roads near the fly tip site would be quiet enough, when the risk of being seen with a body and a carpet in the back of a vehicle would be minimized. Friday afternoon and evening, it seems, provided that window. Witnesses confirm no body before 4 o'clock Friday afternoon. The fire was reported on Friday evening and again on Saturday morning. The window opened, and the killer moved. That 24-hour gap is one of the most haunting details of this entire case. Because it means that somewhere, in the Reading area, in the space of that night and the following day, Vera was being kept. Not alive. But there. In that carpet. In some space, a garage, a garden outbuilding, a room in a property, while the search for her was already underway. While Vera Holland was already telling police that his wife hadn't come home. While the news of her disappearance was beginning to spread through the neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, the secret was being stored. The carpet's outdoor storage markers, the soil, the weeds, tell us that the carpet itself had been outside before it was used. Which suggests that whoever had it had removed it from the bedroom it came from some time before Thursday, November 14th. It had been sitting outside, in a garden, behind a building, somewhere exposed to the elements long enough for organic growth to establish itself in its fibers. This is not a carpet grabbed in an emergency. This is a carpet that was available. That was already outside. Already in a state of readiness, however unintentional that readiness might have been. And here is where the investigative imagination is pulled in a very specific direction. If the carpet was already outside, already removed from its room, already available, who had recently recarpeted a bedroom? Who, in the weeks or months before November 1996, had changed the flooring in a room with matching furniture, with radiator pipes coming up through the floor, and had the old carpet sitting outside rather than disposing of it? This is the question police asked publicly. This is the question that over 100,000 leaflets were trying to answer. This is the question that, if anyone had the answer and chose to share it, might have closed this case in 1996 or 1997. No one came forward with that answer. Or no one who came forward had the right answer. Or the right answer came from someone who was already part of the investigation and whose carpet was therefore already examined and ruled out. We don't know which of these is true. We only know that the carpet was never traced to its source. What we are left with is a shape. The shape of a killer who is local. Who is physically capable. Who had access to a vehicle large enough to transport a body. Who had a carpet. Who knew the A327 and the Two Bridges site specifically enough to choose it twice. Who was cold enough, and organized enough, to manage a 24-hour storage situation while a murder investigation opened around them. Who was close enough to Vera's life, geographically, if not personally, to intercept her in the brief window of a 3 to 5 minute walk. That is a specific shape. And into that shape, investigators poured 3 decades of interviews and forensic work and public appeals and whispered suspicions and dead ends. And the shape remains empty. Waiting for a name. Vera Holland's funeral was held on June 20, 1997, 7 months after her death, at Reading Crematorium in Caversham. 7 months, because investigations of this nature, open questions of this weight, take time to settle into something that can be given a funeral. 7 months of her children waiting. 7 months of Brian Holland living under the shadow of suspicion. 7 months of a community in Shinfield Rise looking at its own streets differently. The inquest in October 1997 recorded unlawful killing. The coroner spoke those words about getting away with it, and they landed in the room and have been echoing ever since. But the echo gets louder, not softer, with time. And there are people who have sat with what they know for 28 years who may, finally, be ready to stop sitting with it. What happens when a community carries a secret for 3 decades? And what happens when the children of the woman who was killed ask, out loud, for that secret to finally be released? That story, the story of the 2016 appeal, of the children who grew up waiting, of the detectives who never stop reviewing this case, is where this investigation goes next. In November 2016, exactly 20 years after Vera Holland's body was found burning on the A327 in Berkshire, her children stood in front of cameras and asked a room full of journalists to help them find the person who had killed their mother. Andrew Bennett and Dawn Reed, Vera's son and daughter from her first marriage, middle-aged by then, carrying 20 years of unanswered grief, read a statement that was careful and controlled and devastating in the way that grief held carefully for 2 decades can be devastating. They were not performatively broken. They were something harder to watch, people who had learned to live with an enormous absence and who had not stopped looking for the thing that would fill it. 20 years ago, they said, someone murdered our mom. In doing so, they robbed us of the love and care that she brought to our family. That's it. That's the whole sentence. Robbed. The language of theft. Because that is what murder is, underneath the forensic language and the investigative terminology and the legal frameworks. It is theft. The theft of a person from the people who needed them. And 20 years had not softened the texture of what had been taken from Andrew and Dawn and their sister Claire, who had been 15 years old and living in that house on St. Barnabas Road the night her mother walked out and never came back. Peter Byrne, who led Thames Valley Police's major crime review team, stood beside them and made his own statement. He acknowledged the decades that had passed. He spoke directly to the possibility that things had changed, that allegiances had shifted, that people who had held back information in 1996 might now be in a position, emotionally or practically, to share it. It might be that allegiances have changed in the last 20 years, he said, or you know something now that you didn't at the time. That is the language of a detective who understands that secrets don't hold their shape forever. People who knew something in 1996 and kept it quiet because of loyalty, or fear, or calculated self-interest, those people have aged. The relationships that locked their silence may have fractured. The person they were protecting may have behaved in ways that eroded the protection they were owed. Time changes the mathematics of a secret, and 20 years is a long time. Byrne also confirmed publicly what Vera's family had already raised, that Christopher Halliwell remained an open line of inquiry. Not a confirmed suspect. Not a named perpetrator. An open question, kept live because the investigators responsible for reviewing this case found the geographical and behavioral overlap too significant to close. Halliwell was active across the Thames Valley area in the 1990s. He was convicted of murders that shared certain characteristics with Vera's case: women taken quickly, moved, held, disposed of with what appeared to be a degree of planning. He knew the roads of rural Berkshire. He knew laybys and quiet spots and the kind of isolated countryside junctions that don't show up on busy road maps. There are things that distinguish Vera's case from what is publicly known about Halliwell's confirmed crimes. The absence of sexual assault is one of them. The nature of the victim, a woman in her 40s, rather than younger women, which is the demographic more commonly associated with predatory sexual violence, is another. But investigators are cautious about ruling anyone in or out on the basis of pattern alone, because patterns in violent crime are never as consistent as behavioral profiles suggest they should be. A killer can change. Can adapt. Can respond to different circumstances with different behaviors. What the police have said, officially, is that the Halliwell question remains open and that no definitive forensic evidence connecting him to Vera's case has been publicly confirmed. What they have not said is that he is ruled out. The difference between those two positions matters enormously. What the 2016 appeal also produced, according to later reporting, was a response. People came forward. Members of the public who had driven the A327 in November 1996, or who had lived in Shinfield Rise, or who had some thread of memory or knowledge related to this case, made contact with Thames Valley Police. Whether any of those contacts produced information that materially changed the investigation is not publicly confirmed. There have been no arrests since 2016. There have been no charges. The case remains unsolved. And yet it continues to breathe. Because the nature of cold cases is not that they die. It is that they wait. They wait in the databases of forensic laboratories where samples are periodically reanalyzed as technology improves. They wait in the filing systems of police major crime review teams who are required to revisit open cases and ask, with the tools now available, whether the evidence can tell them something it couldn't tell the original investigators. They wait in the memories of people who are still alive and still carrying what they know. DNA technology in 2024 is not what it was in 1996. Genealogical DNA analysis, which has solved cases in the United States that were decades old by matching trace evidence to family members through genealogical databases, represents a category of tool that did not exist when Vera's murder was investigated in its first year. If biological material was preserved from the crime scene, from the carpet, from Vera's clothing, from any surface that might have carried trace evidence of her killer, then the possibility exists, however uncertain its timeline, that a name could still emerge from what science can now read in a sample. This is not a guarantee. It is not even a strong probability, given the nature of the scene and the fire that was set. But it is a possibility. And possibilities matter in cases like this. What also matters is the community. Reading. Berkshire. The people who were there in 1996 and who are still there now, or who have moved on but carry their memories with them. The person who replaced a bedroom carpet and had the old one sitting in their garden in the autumn of 1996 and who, for reasons they have lived with for 28 years, did not connect that carpet to the one described in the police leaflets. Or who did connect it, and stayed quiet. The vehicles that were seen near the Two Bridges site, the light-colored Ford Fiestas, the transit van, the black Ford Granada, were driven by people who presumably went home that morning and that day and went on living. People who might have understood, later, what they had been close to. People who might now be in a position to say what they saw with more precision than they felt able to in 1996. The geography of this crime is so local, so contained, that the circle of people with relevant knowledge has never been large. 3 miles. A residential street. A route of 3 to 5 minutes. A fly tip site on a road between two villages. The carpet from a bedroom. This is not a case that stretches across counties or countries. This is a case that fits inside a very small area of South Reading and its immediate surroundings. Which means that the answer, wherever it is close. And there is one more theory worth treating seriously. The possibility that the person who killed Vera Holland was so embedded in the fabric of her community that the investigation circled around them without being able to prove it. Not because the evidence wasn't pointing in the right direction, but because the evidence, the right evidence, the evidence that would hold in court, wasn't available in 1996. Suspicion is not proof. Forensic examination is not always definitive. An arrest and release, as happened twice in this case, is not exoneration, it is a statement that the current available evidence does not meet the threshold for prosecution. It says nothing about what is true. The coroner who said, "It looks like the person who did this will get away with it," he was speaking about the state of the evidence in 1997. He was not speaking about the state of the future. He was not speaking about what science might eventually be able to do with a sample from that carpet. He was not speaking about what an aging conscience might eventually decide to say out loud. He was speaking about 1997. And 1997 is not now. Vera Holland was 47 years old. She was a mother of 3 children who loved her. She was a woman who ran a milk round with her husband before the sun rose and came home and made a life out of ordinary things. She left her house on a dark Thursday evening to get food for her family and she never came back. And somewhere, in a person who is now older, perhaps much older, than they were in November 1996, the knowledge of what happened to her is still alive. The question is whether that knowledge will remain private, or whether the weight of it will finally become too heavy to carry alone. That question has no answer yet. But it is not unanswerable. And there is one more thing to say. One more dimension of this case that we have not yet fully addressed. Because the question of what happened to Vera is not just a forensic question. It is not just a question about a carpet and a fire and a timeline. It is a question about what Vera was trying to get back to. About what she was walking toward when she put on that pink coat and stepped out into the November dark. She was walking back to her family. She was walking back to her husband and her daughter in the warm interior of a house where people were waiting for her. She was carrying, in her head, a completely ordinary expectation, that she would be home in 20 minutes, that she would sit down with the people she loved, that Thursday evening would end the way Thursday evenings always ended. Quietly. Normally. With all the unremarkable beauty of a life that is simply proceeding. That is what was taken from her. Not just the remaining decades of her life, though those were taken too. But the evening. The ordinary, warm, inconsequential Thursday evening. The return home. The closed door. The kettle on. That was taken, along with everything else. And that is what her children have carried. Not just the grief of losing a mother. But the grief of knowing that she was taken in the middle of the most ordinary thing. Not on the edge of anything significant. Just going to get food. Just trying to get home. There are some cases that you can set down. There are cases in true crime where the resolution, however partial, however unsatisfying, provides enough structure that the mind can find a resting place. A conviction. A sentence. A face to attach to the thing that was done. Even in cases where the legal process feels inadequate, there is something that functions as a bracket, a before and an after, a point at which the official account of events achieves its form and the world moves on. Vera Holland's case is not one of those cases. Vera Holland's case is the kind that doesn't let go. The kind that follows you from the screen into the quiet of an ordinary evening, because ordinary evenings are precisely the texture of this case. Because what this case says, with terrible clarity, is that the line between an ordinary evening and a catastrophic one can be as thin as a few minutes on a road in November. As thin as the gap between a door closing behind you and whatever is waiting on the other side of it. And the case is still open. Nearly 30 years later. The case is still open. Think about what that means for Vera's children. Andrew and Dawn, who stood at that press conference in 2016 and asked the world to remember their mother, are now in their 50s and 60s. Claire, who was 15 years old and living in the house on St. Barnabas Road when her mother walked out and never came back, is in her mid-40s. She was a teenager who one day had a mother who came home from the milk round and made breakfast and existed in all the taken-for-granted ways that parents exist when they're simply there, and then, on an ordinary Thursday evening, that presence ended. Without explanation. Without justice. Without closure of any meaningful kind. The inquest recorded unlawful killing. The coroner said what he said. The funeral happened 7 months after the murder, at Reading Crematorium in Caversham, in the summer of 1997. And then the world kept going. The investigation kept going, in its quiet and diminishing way. The files stayed open on the desks of major crime review officers. The carpet was described in leaflets that gradually yellowed and were thrown away. And Vera's children built their adult lives around a hole that has never been filled. There is no resolution to offer here. There is no name to give you, no courtroom scene, no moment of confession or arrest. There is only the shape of what happened, and the questions that shape raises, and the hope, the entirely reasonable, evidence-supported hope, that the shape will one day find a name to fit it. So let's end by going back to the beginning. Let's go back to Shinfield Rise on a Thursday evening in November. Let's go back to St. Barnabas Road and a woman who was, by every account, exactly what a woman in the middle of her life should be, working, loving, present, ordinary in all the most dignified ways. Let's go back to the pink coat, 3/4 length, or a duffel coat, depending on who you ask, which is itself a small act of love, the insistence of people who knew her on getting the details right. The green tartan skirt. The black jumper. The black shoes. Clothes chosen for an errand, not a journey. The wardrobe of someone who expected to be home before her absence was even noticed. She walked out of her front door at 6:10 in the evening. The dark had already settled in the way November dark settles in Berkshire, dense and early and cold. She walked toward the KFC on Shinfield Road. She knew the route. She didn't hesitate. She had no reason to hesitate. And somewhere in the brief, ordinary geography of a walk she had probably made before, something happened that ended her life. She never arrived. And 4 hours later, when Brian called the police and said his wife hadn't come home from getting a takeaway, the investigation that would consume the next years, and then the next decades, of Thames Valley Police's resources began. A slow, massive, ultimately incomplete search for the truth of what happened in the space of a few minutes on a dark suburban road in 1996. The carpet is still out there in the records. 9 feet 4 inches by 8 feet 2 inches, fawn-colored, bedroom quality, with 2 furniture indentations and 2 radiator pipe holes and the soil and weeds of outdoor storage woven into its fibers. Somebody removed that carpet from a bedroom. Somebody had it sitting outside. Somebody used it. And that somebody has never been named. The vehicles are in the records too. The light-colored Ford Fiestas. The transit van. The black Ford Granada. The drivers of those vehicles, wherever they are now, were on the A327 near the Two Bridges site in the hours surrounding when Vera's body was placed there. They were not asked about it at the time, or they were asked and gave information that didn't break the case. But memories are strange things. Memory does not always yield itself fully under pressure in the middle of an investigation. Sometimes it yields itself years later, when the pressure is off and something triggers the recollection with sudden, unexpected clarity. The person who killed Vera Holland is either still alive or they are not. If they are alive, they have lived for 28 years with the knowledge of what they did. They have had conversations and eaten meals and possibly laughed and possibly built things and possibly watched the news stories about Vera and about Christopher Halliwell and about Thames Valley Police's appeals, and they have managed, somehow, to keep the secret intact across decades. That is not nothing. That is a sustained act of will that must, over time, have a cost. Secrets of this magnitude are not carried without weight. And the people around them. The people who know something, not everything, but something, about a carpet, or a vehicle, or where someone was on the evening of November 14, 1996. The people whose silence has been a kind of complicity, however they have rationalized it to themselves. Those people are older now too. The relationships that made their silence feel necessary may have changed. The calculations they made in 1996 may look different in 2024. Time has a way of rearranging the algebra of loyalty. Vera's children asked, in 2016, for anyone with information to contact Thames Valley Police on 101 or Crime Stoppers anonymously on 0800 555 111. Those channels still exist. Those cases are still live. And if you are watching this and something in this story has triggered a memory, or confirmed something you have wondered about, or given a name to something you've carried quietly for a long time, please Use one of those channels. You can do it anonymously. You can do it without your name being attached to it. You can do it in a way that protects you while giving Vera's family what they have waited, for nearly 30 years, to finally receive. Because this is what it comes down to, at the end of a story like this. Not the forensic detail, however carefully assembled. Not the timeline reconstruction or the carpet dimensions or the vehicle sightings or the theories about Christopher Halliwell. It comes down to a mother of 3 who put on a pink coat on a Thursday evening and expected to come home. It comes down to a teenage daughter who was in the house when her mother left and who is now in her 40s and who has lived more of her life without her mother than she ever lived with her. It comes down to Andrew and Dawn, who stood in front of cameras 20 years after the fact and said, with the quiet dignity of people who have not given up, that someone murdered their mom. Somewhere, a bedroom once had that carpet. Somewhere, someone replaced it. And somewhere, someone still knows exactly what happened in those missing minutes on a dark November road in Reading. Vera Holland deserves better than the silence that has surrounded her case for 28 years. She deserves a name. She deserves the thing that the legal system calls justice, however imperfect that thing always is. She deserves to be remembered as a person and not merely as a cold case entry. As a woman in the middle of her life who was going to get food for her family and who had every reason to expect she'd be back before the evening was over. She was not a headline. She was not a statistic. She was Vera. She was someone's mom. She was someone's wife. She was someone who got up before dawn to run a milk round, and who wore a pink coat in November, and who had children who loved her and who are still looking for answers. This story isn't over. It is waiting for the person who knows the ending to finally say it out loud. If this video has moved you, if it has given you something to think about, or something to feel, or something to share, then please do share it. Because sharing keeps Vera's name alive, and Vera's name being alive matters. It matters to her family. It matters to the investigation. It matters in ways that ripple outward from a screen and into the world in ways we can't always predict. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think happened. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what piece of this story got under your skin. I read every single comment, and the conversation that happens in that space is part of what keeps stories like this one breathing. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment. This channel is where stories like Vera's live. Where they get told with the care and detail they deserve. Where the cases that didn't make national headlines get the attention that was always owed to them. Subscribe. Hit the bell. And come back for the next one, because the next story is already waiting, and it is every bit as important as this one. Vera Holland. Born April 8, 1949. Murdered November 14 to 16, 1996. Gone but not forgotten. Not by her children. Not by this channel. Not by you, now that you know her name. Say it. Remember it. And keep the pressure on for the truth.